One of the best villains in film history, as well as one of the most beloved heroes, Basil Rathbone was a consummate actor who brought skill and ability to every role he played, and left an indelible mark in the world of screen villainy and brilliance. Born in Johannesburg, South Africa on June 13, 1892, his family had to flee the country 3 years later after his father was accused by the Boers of being a British spy, as the tensions in the region were building to the Boer War. His father had been born in Liverpool, England, and was a mining engineer, while his mother had been born in Grahamstown, South Africa, to British parents and was a violinist. Attending Ripton School in Derbyshire from 1906 to 1910, he excelled at sports, especially fencing, and became interested in the theatre. Basil's father discouraged a career on the stage and asked his son to take a job in business for 1 year. Honoring his father's request, the young Basil took a job as a clerk for an insurance company, and then quit 1 year later to the day. With the help of his cousin Frank Benson, who managed the Shakespearean group, Basil finally made it to the stage with the condition he would work his way up. It took Basil only 2 years to go from bit parts to juvenile leads. However, 2 years later, his career was interrupted and brought to a standstill by World War I. Basil was drafted into the British Army in 1915 under the Derby scheme as a private into the London Scottish Regiment. A regiment that also held other future greats, Claude Range, Ronald Colman, and Herbert Marshall. In fact, Claude Range and Basil would perform together over 20 years later in The Adventures of Robin Hood. After basic training, Basil received a commission as a second lieutenant in the 210th Battalion of the King's Liverpool Regiment, working as an intelligence officer and rising to the rank of captain. He also found the chance to continue his enthusiasm for fencing, twice being the regimental champion. The war would have a deep impact on the young actor, as it did on many. He wrote letters home talking about stepping over death and looking at what used to be the living, and that it could be him in the mud the next day. He also wrote home about the death of his brother. In a letter from 1918, he said, "I want to tell him to mind his place. I think of his ridiculous belief that everything would always be well, his ever-hopeful smile, and I want to cuff him for a little fool. He had no business to let it happen, and it maddens me that I shall never be able to tell him so, or change it, or bring him back. I can't think of him without being consumed with anger at him for being dead, and beyond anything I can do for him." During the war, Basil pushed the confines of reconnaissance and intelligence when he convinced his superiors to let him gather information during the day rather than under the cover of darkness, for which action he was awarded the Military Cross for conspicuous daring and resource on patrol. He later had this to say about the honor awarded him. "All I did, old man, was disguise myself as a tree. That's correct, a tree, and cross no man's land to gather a bit of information from the German lines. I have not since been called upon to play a tree." Released from military service in 1919, he returned to Stratford-on-Avon and continued with Shakespeare before moving to the London stage the following year, and made his film debut in 1921 in The Innocents. Continuing on stage through the 20s, he made the occasional film, not pursuing a career in front of the cameras until 1929, when Basil played in The Bishop Murder Case, as none other than Philo Vance. With steady work coming from Tinchelltown, it wasn't long, like with other contemporaries such as Vincent Price, that Basil was cast as the suave villain in films such as David Copperfield, 1935, Anna Karenina, the same year, and again in Captain Blood, alongside none other than Errol Flynn. Considered to be the best swordsman in Hollywood history, a skill he practiced 4 days a week, and even teaching on-screen opponents Errol Flynn and Tyrone Power the finer points of the art, he only won 2 on-screen sword matches. His most well-beloved and enduring role as a villain would come in 1938 as Sir Guy of Gisborne in the classic The Adventures of Robin Hood, a film that also holds one of the all-time classic sword fights in Hollywood history. But it wouldn't be until the next year, 1939, that Basil would step into his most remembered and beloved role of his entire career when he put on the deerstalker cap and embodied the great detective Sherlock Holmes in Hound of the Baskervilles, at 20th Century Fox with Nigel Bruce playing the faithful Dr. Watson. The film was so successful that a sequel was put into production and released that same year. A rumor has been around for a long time that he was the choice of the author in another classic and landmark film that same year, but was rejected by the producers, who cast Clark Gable in the role of Rhett Butler in Gone with the Wind. Whether Margaret Mitchell was serious about Basil for the role or not is speculated, but she also joked about casting Groucho Marx in the role as well. More films had been planned in the Holmes series by Fox, but with the outbreak of World War II, the studio dropped the plans, believing that the appeal of Sherlock Holmes would be lost amongst the more relevant stories concerning world events. Apparently, Fox thought there was still room for historical dramas in the world conflict, because the next year saw Basil in another of his famous villain roles, the classic Tyrone Power film, Zorro, in which the two battled it out together on screen in a very impressive fencing match. Though they were both skilled fencers, Basil said that Power could fence Errol Flynn into a hat. They both preferred to do the scenes that didn't require close-ups with their fencing trainers for safety reasons. Watch the fight and I think you'll see why. But apparently the detective from Baker Street couldn't be kept down long, because in 1942, with the U.S. fully engaged in the world conflict in both the European and Pacific theaters, Universal Studios revived the Holmes series, moving him into the present conflict of the world, with an explanation at the beginning of the film stating that the detective was ageless, and the Allies were given an unbeatable hero for the war effort. Over the next 5 years, Basil would play the great detective 12 times in film, as well as performing the role on radio steadily since 1939. Appearing in only 5 non-Holmes films in those 5 years, he became the embodiment of Holmes, a role he felt he had been born to play, and that many believe is the best interpretation of the character of all time, seconded only to Jeremy Brett, almost 40 years later. However, Basil soon became the victim of typecasting, even reaching the point where people would ask for the autograph of Holmes instead of Basil. Knowing that he would still need a career when the series ended, Basil decided in 1946, with Universal still holding the rights to 21 Holmes stories, with 2 years left in the agreement with the Arthur Conan Doyle estate, to bid farewell to Holmes and left. Returning to the stage for the next 2 years, 1949 would finally see his return to film as the narrator of the animated short, The Wind in the Willows. Film roles were not as readily found for Basil through the 1950s, but he did find some, such as Casanova's Big Night with Bob Hope, Court Jester with Danny Kaye, which is touted by many to have the best sword fight ever filmed, and of course Basil played the villain. And he played Jacob Marley in the 1955 version of A Christmas Carol, as well as appearing with Humphrey Bogart in We're No Angels, and John Ford's The Last Hurrah. Even though movie work was scarce, television was a viable option for Basil as he appeared on such shows as the Philip Morris Theater, Studio One in Hollywood, the Eddie Cantor Comedy Hour, played Svengali in the television movie Svengali and the Blonde, Science Fiction Theater, and Suspense, where he would once again play Sherlock Holmes. Although he tried to distance himself from his portrayal, he would slide back into the character from time to time, such as in Suspense as mentioned before, as well as in a Broadway play in 1953 written by his wife. It was to co-star his friend Nigel Bruce once again as Dr. Watson, but Bruce was unable to take the role because of illness, which led to the casting of Jack Rain. The absence of his friend, who would die that same year, had a negative effect on Basil, and the play would run for only 3 performances. Basil recorded several spoken word albums, such as The Night Before Christmas, selected stories from Edgar Allan Poe, Oliver Twist, Peter and the Wolf, and A Christmas Carol. The 1960s saw a rise in film work for Basil, varying from low-level horror films, such as Hillbillies in the Haunted House, with Lon Chaney Jr., to more higher-rated horror, such as Tales of Terror with Vincent Price and Peter Lorre, a comedy of terrors, again with Vincent Price and Peter Lorre, and this time along with Boris Karloff. That sounds like the best quartet of terror you could dream of. Basil Rathbone died on July 21, 1967, in New York City from a heart attack at the age of 75. And although he never renounced his British citizenship, he was buried at Ferncliff Cemetery in Hartsdale, New York. In a career that lasted over 5 decades, he did it all, from matinee leading man to despicable villain. And whether you remember him for the great detective, swashbuckling villains, or master of terror, his career was anything but elementary.